I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet, when far away an interrupted cry came over the houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night.
Madam, if your head had matched your heart, I would be the one awaiting death.
When it comes to an executed queen, I like to dedicate an entire video to the historical context as to how she ended up on the scaffold and how it was depicted on screen, including all the little details. With Mary Queen of Scots, I covered the bulk of historical context in the video where I covered her life, so I suppose that means we can cut straight to the chase and instead talk about how many times Mary Stuart's execution was caught on screen. Spoiler alert, it's most of them. All, save for The Serpent Queen, Horrible Histories and the Thea Musgrave opera, do not feature the execution. And even when Mary's execution has been depicted, it's not been up to standard. The infamous story of the headsman taking several attempts to cut her head off is only featured in 2 out of 16 depictions. Is it because of censorship issues? Or because the creators were trying to give Mary a more dignified send-off than the one she was actually given? Let's go through this together. As I said, I've gone over the context as to why Mary ended up on the scaffold. She had been held prisoner for nearly 20 years. Walsingham and Cecil wanted to be rid of her. Walsingham used Anthony Babington to set her up for a fall and gathered evidence of her treasonous actions. Elizabeth hesitated, but ultimately the deed was done. Mary Queen of Scots was not the first person in the Tudor era alone to have a rough execution, and she wouldn't even have the worst of it. When Margaret Pole was executed in 1541, it took a dozen blows of the axe to behead her. This was down to 2 deciding factors. One, she was struggling violently, initially having to be brought to her execution kicking and screaming, and also because the executioner was very inexperienced. According to John Fox, Thomas Cromwell's executioner was also inexperienced, claiming it took half an hour for the 2 executioners to sever his head. Speculation claimed that this was a deliberate move by his enemies to spite him to death. But sometimes it's just plain bad luck. Thomas Seymour suffered 2 strokes at the hands of the axeman in 1549, and unless Edward VI and the Duke of Somerset really didn't like him, it's unlikely that the choice of executioner was deliberate. There's a documentary somewhere, probably with Dan Jones in it, that showed a less gory demonstration as to why execution by block and axe wasn't always cleanly done. For one thing, the axe is a top-heavy weapon. Bringing it down on so small a target as the human neck requires a level of skill and accuracy. When they compared it with the French executioner's sword, akin to the one Anne Boleyn was beheaded with, the killing blow was much cleaner, as the sword had more room to swing. And of course, there is also the possibility that the axe simply isn't sharp enough, or the nerve gets to the executioner at the last minute. It was customary for the condemned to tip the executioner to ensure that they would have a more merciful blow, because a slighted headsman was less likely to be quick with it. But there's also one more factor which is very important to keep in mind when it comes to Mary's execution, because the last person to be executed via beheading in Elizabeth's reign had been Thomas Percy of Northumberland in 1572, and after Mary there would not be another beheading until 1601 when Robert Devereux was executed. Elizabeth preferred to submit those convicted of treason to hanging, drawing and quartering. While this punishment also included beheading, that was usually after the condemned had already died from having their internal organs ripped out, so it didn't really matter if the axeman missed or not. Beheading as a punishment was reserved only for those of high birth and station anyway. The commoners would always get the more brutal punishment to serve as an example to others. But if Mary was a queen, even a deposed queen, why didn't Elizabeth send for a French swordsman as Henry VIII had done for her mother? Well, because back then England still owned Calais and sent for their local executioner. By 1587, England had lost Calais, thanks to Mary I, and England was not on good terms with France due to all those pesky wars of religion, and they certainly would not have allowed one of their executioners to behead one of their former queen consorts, even if Catherine de Medici didn't like Mary that much. Therefore, Mary was in a very unlucky situation. While I could not find the identity of the executioner, as they were almost always kept anonymous, it is likely that they had never severed a human neck before, or at the very least, not done so in almost 16 years. The duty was often handed to a person or passed down through generations, rather than something people applied to. It was not seen as a desirable occupation, and those who were tasked with it would usually struggle to find work elsewhere. I think Mary's fate was ultimately down to bad luck, rather than spite by Cecil and Walsingham. Elizabeth, who was risking war with Catholic Europe, would absolutely not want to give Mary a painful death that would add to her enemy's cause, and the news of how it went horrified her. But Mary, who was already looking upon her death like a martyr, who went to her end with her head held high, may have seen this as either a final indignity to her ill-fated life, or necessary to highlight her martyrdom and the shedding of blood for her faith. Since I started this channel, there is one question I have to ask. What is the point of doing a Tudor/Renaissance drama if you can't get the execution scenes right? For all my griping of having these Marys not show the full execution scene, there is a reason to some of it. Because while we may not see the literal depiction, we still get Mary on her way to the scaffold or putting her head on the block before the axe swings. So Mary is at least given privacy from her gruesome death, and it's up to the viewers to fill in the blanks. But others really just kind of floundered the execution scene. First, I will start with the Virgin Queen and Gunpowder, Treason and Plot, because I pretty much have the same things to say about these two scenes. They are so quickly glossed over that the impact of Mary's death doesn't allow time for the viewer to let it sink in. Granted, in these instances, Mary is not the focal character in these scenes. Her death is something for both Elizabeth and James to mull over as they consider the cold hard decision they've made, especially James, who has allowed his mother's execution so long as he becomes Elizabeth's successor. He never knew his mother and has always bore a grudge for being separated from her. Plus, he really does not like Catholics. But at the same time, she is still his mother, and he's doing nothing to save her. What I don't like about these two iterations is just how little ceremony there is to it. Mary walks in, goes straight to the block, and kneels down. Nothing else. She doesn't remove her veil or her dress to reveal her red petticoat. She doesn't even pray. She's just like, well, we're here. Let's get this over with. I think we could have spared a few more seconds. The Virgin Queen at least gets the excuse of focusing on Elizabeth's struggle rather than Mary's. Thus, it phased to her putting her head on the block in a very metaphorical sense. But with G-Tap, we followed Mary's story for an hour and a half. And this is how you send off the main character of a previous episode. It's like the theatrical cut of Return of the King all over again. I've already spoken about why the literal film called The Execution of Mary Queen of Scots was both infamous and inaccurate. It showed the axe coming down and cutting Mary's head off with a single stroke, using a jump cut to have the executioner decapitate a mannequin instead of the actor. Given Victorian sensibilities of the time, it would have been horrifying enough to show Mary beheaded with one blow, let alone how it really went down in history. It was common knowledge that Mary had a brutal death at the time, but perhaps Edison and his crew ruled this out as too gory. Next up, we have the depictions that show the axe falling, but cut away from impact to focus on something else while not adding that it took more than one blow. the PG-13 cut if you will. That being Elizabeth the Golden Age, Reign, and the Vanessa Redgrave movie. Golden Age's version has been dubbed the most celestial execution scene of all time. In a sense it is. We have the contrast of Mary calmly and resolutely going to the block dressed in red, almost seeing her death as fulfilling her destiny as a Catholic martyr. Meanwhile, Elizabeth is anxiously pacing around, with her concerned ladies following her, dressed in green and paralysed with fear as she worries what will happen. As the axe comes down on Mary, it cuts to both Tom Hollander closing his eyes and Fleming crying out. But most importantly, we only see one stroke of the axe. Unless you already know how badly it went, you think it was a swift, clean job, but at the same time you can interpret that Fleming's reaction was at how gory her mistress's death was, even if it's not voiced later on. The Vanessa Redgrave film is also guilty of cutting away, and hinting that Mary died after one blow. But this scene is still pretty well filmed. We get hints towards the ultimate wig reveal by showing Seaton placing the wig on her mistress's head before they are summoned. Mary wears a white veil down to the scaffold, both declaring her supposed innocence while also making her distinct from everyone else in the scene. Those witnessing it are all dressed in black, and the castle hall is shown in a grey and drab backdrop. Therefore, it makes it all the more striking when Mary reveals her red dress underneath, which gets a visible shocked reaction from the crowd. As the axe comes down, it cuts to Elizabeth, wearing black in mourning of her cousin and visibly crying, while keeping her composure. Perhaps the execution went as historically recorded, and off-screen, Elizabeth has just been told the details of it and has dismissed those who have brought her the news, along with Mary's cross and prayer book. It's also used to compound Elizabeth's loneliness, both in her role as queen and the decision she has made to have one mistress and no master. Now, Reign has a little more leeway in terms of scrutiny, because I know full well that the show was cancelled while season 4 was still in production, so the creators were trying to wrap up things as best they could. Therefore, the last few scenes of the final episode jump from Mary being detained after Darnley's murder to 1587. We cut between Mary at Fotheringhay Castle and Elizabeth back in London. Elizabeth is talking directly to a now grown King James, who is attempting to plead for his mother's life. Mary is hoping that James will save her, which of course was not what the real Mary was hoping for, as she was resigned to her fate. Elizabeth ultimately convinces James that Mary will not unite England and Scotland. Instead, she gives him the choice of saving his mother or becoming her heir. He reluctantly accepts the latter, and the execution goes ahead. If you have watched the show from beginning to end as I have, you'll notice where they've cut some corners in the execution scene. The Great Hall of Fotheringhay is just the throne room from the French castle. Would have been nice to have seen the French and thus Catherine's perspective on this. Mary remains wearing black in the scene. I think something red would have contrasted the darkness of the hall. I did wonder if they were going to go for the hack job, as the show never shied away from showing blood and violence. But no, instead the executioner swings, and we immediately cut to Mary waking up in the afterlife next to Francois. That's as much detail as I'm going to get into now, because I've still got the final Reign review to do. If you put this in any other Mary Queen of Scots film, minus the afterlife scene, it wouldn't look too out of place. I just kind of wish she was actually wearing the red dress. And of course, in the Six the Kids animatic by RTE, it shows Mary's killing blow be witnessed by Elizabeth as she bursts into the hall too late to Mary waking up in her sixth persona. This is more of a dramatic license sort of thing, as the animatic is both a quick summary of events, but also serves as a music video, so we'll just call music video logic and leave it at that. So the last four Marys, see what I did there, before getting to the more accurate two, are the Saoirse Ronan, Camilla Rutherford, Katharine Hepburn and Donizetti portrayals. It is really hard to keep track of all these different ones when they have the same title or something similar. In the Rutherford movie, the execution scene doesn't come at the end of the film. Instead, it is placed as Mary has realised her feelings for Bothwell. I still think it's really confusing, as we are meant to believe that Mary is telling the story in flashback on the night before her execution, only to have the execution scene anyway before she continues narrating. I guess you could say that the decision to let herself love Bothwell will lead to her ultimate fate. Historically, the backdrop for the execution is pretty accurate. She dresses down to the red petticoat and everything. The scene fades out as she looks up from the block to see the sunlight coming through the window, the last light she will ever see. It then jumps back to the present, as her distracted thoughts make her ride into some branches and she falls from her horse, sees a vision of a faceless Elizabeth who refuses to help her and rides away. I mean, it's good, I just think it would have been better suited for the ending scene. The Ronan film both opens and closes with Mary's execution. In the beginning, Mary is faceless with the camera only focusing on her back. The same goes to Elizabeth as she paces the courtyard alone as it starts snowing. The scene is shown again at the end, but this time with the camera facing both Mary and Elizabeth. Both times they show this ridiculously dramatic reveal of Mary's red dress, as two of her ladies, one of which is Seton, tear it off from either side. You know what this reminds me of? Very, very silly. The way Mary kneels on the block is also very awkward. There were different types of execution this block. The one presented here is so low that the condemned would have to lie down to rest their head. But Mary is nonetheless kneeling. She's even kneeling on a stool so there's extra height. That can't be comfortable for Ronan if she has to do that for multiple takes. I'm not surprised the executioner couldn't get her head off in one strike approaching it from that angle. Just as the executioner prepares to strike, the scene and the film cuts out, with Mary almost breaking the fourth wall, and the audience is left to contemplate that that's 2 hours they're never going to get back. The Donizetti opera, as shown by the Joyce DiDonato rendition and Mary of Scotland, both fade out as Mary makes her way to the scaffold. Both have a symbolic depiction of Mary ascending from her life. In Mary of Scotland, Mary's resignation is brought on by news of Bothwell's death, and spends the whole night before her execution praying. She utters one last prayer before she goes to the block. You can tell she hasn't moved from that spot, as the candle on the table, that was a good 50 centimetres at best when Mary and Elizabeth were talking, has now burned all the way down. The execution appears to be taking place outside, and surprisingly the guards all kneel when Mary appears at the doorway. That never would have happened. She reaches the scaffold steps, and her headdress and ruff are unceremoniously taken from her by Elizabeth's men. With no ladies with her, you can assume that she will be executed in that dress. She climbs the scaffold slowly, and the camera angle makes it look like the stairs are endless. There is fear on her face, punctuated by a crack of thunder and the skies growing dark. But then she reaches the top, and the music fades from a dramatic dirge to the sound of Bothwell's pipers, assuring Mary that her death will reunite her with him. The fear goes from her face as the camera pans up to the dark clouds, a fork of lightning, and then the end. The final scene of the Donizetti opera likewise ends with Mary going to the block, with the previous scene blending seamlessly into the final one. There is a giant staircase at the back of the stage, with the block visible upon it. The chorus mournfully gathers to witness the execution, all of whom are draped in black so as to contrast when Mary reveals her red petticoat. There's also her saying goodbye to Robert Dudley, who is being forced to watch her die, but I won't talk about that because it goes against my historical OTP. Mary visibly trembles as her ladies prepare her, and they reference the wig reveal by removing it prior to her climbing the steps. Finally, she is blindfolded and ascends the scaffold where the axeman is waiting. Of course, the blindfold is just thin enough so DiDonato can actually see what she's doing. Afterwards it fades to black. As such, these two portrayals still give Mary her dramatic send-off, and if you want, you can assume that the hack job by the executioner still happened, we just didn't get to see it. Now we come to Elizabeth I and Elizabeth R, the only two that have featured the gory spectacle of Mary's execution. Starting with Elizabeth I, as the show has not featured Mary much preceding her execution, we are now seeing her death mostly from the perspective of Robert Dudley, who has agreed to witness the execution on behalf of the Privy Council, accompanied by his stepson Robert Devereux. Though the scene takes place outside in a courtyard instead of a hall, the rest of the scene is pretty accurate. Everything seems set up to give Mary the dramatic end she has wished for. She goes there with her head held high, comforting her maid as she reaches the scaffold. It's almost as if Mary is seeing things like she's in a movie, but Dudley, and by extension we, are watching that from the outside. He almost derides her for wearing red to her execution, but even he's displeased to see Mary's rosary taken from her before she is done with it. She tries to pray in Latin, but the Protestant preacher on the scaffold with her drowns her out by reading scripture in English. And more importantly, we actually see the axe come down on Mary and her cry out in pain, except it's not a cry, it's more of a gurgled squawk. The way the executioner lifts her head, only for it to fall and go bouncing off the scaffold, would have been comic if the situation wasn't so dire. Dudley is visibly disgusted by how it went down and dreads telling Elizabeth the details, but he, as Elizabeth's favourite, is the only one who can tell her of the events, whom she will reasonably listen to. There is no music in the scene. That way the realism carries more impact. As for Elizabeth R, though this is still a series primarily from Elizabeth's perspective, Mary has been set up as a formidable rival to her, and built up enough through episode 2 and the episode where she is executed, so her death has more effect. The silence of the execution scene is almost deafening, though there are some spikes of music in the build-up, as she is summoned and tells her ladies that
the end of Mary Stuart's troubles is now done.
And Elizabeth sits up in bed, unable to sleep because she knows what's happening. Once Mary has entered the hall, there is nothing to be heard but footsteps and the sounds of Mary's clothes as they are removed and revealed the red dress, before she finally kneels at the block. She takes extra time to position her head correctly. This block is very small, much like the one seen in the Lady Jane Grey painting. Therefore, I am not surprised that hacking Mary's head off took so many attempts. No one makes a sound as the thump of the executioner's axe comes down, making the audience even more uncomfortable. While the chopping is happening just out of frame, sometimes not seeing it makes it worse because the viewer can already picture how it's going to go. Eventually it stops and cuts to Mary's head with her body on the other side of the block. It's a grim spectacle, and Elizabeth reacts to it with as much disgust as if she was actually there. Death is a motif that follows Elizabeth throughout the episode, along with the fact that one queen cannot live peacefully while the other survives. Death has followed Elizabeth since her birth. Her existence was preserved and endangered by death. Now Mary is dead, it haunts her more than ever. While not the longest of my definitive moment videos, it goes to show that there are many ways to approach a single historical event, depending on the tone, character, perspective and context. The struggle with showing Mary Queen of Scots' execution, however, always seems to be avoiding the literally bloody truth. It does surprise me that the majority of these Marys have ordained to cut away or abstain from showing the numerous blows it took, because that would kind of put a dampener on the kind of story they're telling. But also there's a censorship issue. The opera gets a pass on this because you can't actually show beheading on stage. The BBC and Channel 4 could get away with showing Mary's death more realistically, because those British networks are less strict with showing violence. If it's being shown after the watershed, anything goes. I don't know when we'll next see a Mary Queen of Scots execution depicted. I seriously doubt that the Serpent Queen will get that far. But if we do get one, we'll have all of these to compare it with. And now we move on to the final video about Mary Stuart, asking the question, was she always doomed to fail? And that was the many executions of Mary Queen of Scots. Whoops! If I can stop being clumsy for 5 minutes. Let's talk about how the year's gonna go. Oh, by the way, you might see the light fluctuate a little bit. We're on the tail end of a storm. We just had a storm come and hit the UK. It wasn't as bad here as it was up north. Some places lost their power. So yeah, it might get dark, might get bright. This is how it's gonna happen. So yes, this was my first video of the year. Not as detailed as I would have hoped it to have been, but I've literally just come off like a 7-week stint working full-time for a Christmas panto. So next up, hopefully next week, it's just going to be a quick 5-10 minute video about the history of Nottingham Castle. It's a video I kind of wanted to start off 2024 with, had I been able to finish up Mary Queen of Scots and Richard III last year, but then we had this sudden change where it was like, hey, we need you to cover for a panto. It's going to be 7 weeks. You're going to be working double show days for 37 days plus a week of tech, which is 12 hours a day. And then that's not including the hour-and-a-half commute either way. So yeah, I've been very, very tired. I want to get this video out because it's like, I've been wanting to make a Nottingham Castle video for like since the castle reopened for the public. And then I made a little plan in this notebook. So February, where however you want to pronounce it. February, Valentine's Day, as I said, I want to do a hot takes video on 10 adaptations of Romeo and Juliet. So yes, I'm going to include the Baz Luhrmann version, and the Zeffirelli one, and the one with Alan Rickman in it, and hopefully that month I will also finish up my coverage on Richard III, and then March we'll have another Patreon poll to decide the next subject. March I will be finishing up Mary Queen of Scots and doing my final Reign review, as well as the first 2 of the last 5 Titanic reviews, because it'd be nice to finish up Titanic coverage in April. Don't know why it took me so long, but yeah, April will also be the 50 more famous faces of Titanic. There's a sequel to my 50 famous faces of Titanic video, because that's my most popular video and people keep leaving comments saying you should have done this, you should have done this. It was just like, well, fine, I will go through the comments, take every name I can find, do a little bio on them, fill it out to 50. We'll do that. And also April, I'll be starting on the next Screen Queen, which will be Catherine de Medici, Queen of Venom. That is probably going to be a whole coverage in one video, because there are only like 5 on-screen Catherines I've been able to find. There are some that I can't find. I will cover the lost media in that video as well. That's probably going to be a pretty long video. That might be released on my birthday. And also, when I get to the end of this Titanic coverage, I'm going to round up all the fictional characters from these movies, TV shows and video games and put them in the Hunger Games simulator. That's my plans for the year so far, because plans might change. So I'm only just planning as far as April, and then we'll see where things go from there. And now I'm just going to want to comment on something that's kind of happened recently. I mean, this is probably a few weeks ago by the time this video is released, but as I have been working, I haven't been able to comment on it. I really wanted to do a post, but I thought, nah, I'll do it in a video. Because there has been a little bit of a controversy on BookTube, BookTok, BookTwitter, like the big 3, regarding a certain author. And I'm not going to say she's stupid, just not very bright, but she was a debut author. She's not going to be a debut author now. She decided that to promote her book that was coming out this year, she would promote herself by denigrating, that's a big word, denigrating many other debut authors, many of whom were POC on Goodreads, by giving them like 1-star, 2-star reviews, and then making tons and tons of fake accounts rating their book 5 stars. You can get the full story of it by finding the TikTok made by Hiran J. Zhao, author of Iron Widow. They have a sequel coming out later this year. Hiran J. Zhao exposed the whole thing, like the lies, the receipts, all of this, and I was watching this and I was just completely blown away. Now that author has been found out, they've been exposed, she is screwed, basically. She has ruined her credibility before a single book could even be released. Like, just how many authors out there are struggling to get a book deal, to get seen even a little bit by a publisher, that are thinking maybe they're not very good. I mean, I've been through this. I completely blew my confidence on my writing ability before I started this YouTube channel, working over and over on this one novel idea, thinking, oh, if I change it that little bit, maybe a publisher would like it, but I just kept getting rejections or not even like a response. You're trapped in this cycle of self-doubt. So if you are lucky enough to get a book deal, why would you sabotage yourself like that? So I'm making reading list for 2024. I did not do much reading this last year, 2023. I think I didn't even keep a list of what I read. I'm I'm already on my 3rd book of the year, which is nice. I started the year finishing the first Witcher book, and then I read Hollyborn's The Places I've Cried in Public. I read that in 3 days because, like, within the first week of the new year, which was nice. I've never done that before. And mostly I read it so quickly because I just wanted this main character to be okay. Oh, it was so sad. And now I'm on a bit of a fantasy craze. So yes, I'm reading Twin Crowns by Catherine Doyle and Catherine Webber. This is mostly because I've been recommended a bunch of fantasy books that have parallels with certain Barbie movies. Barbie movies are good, actually. So this one has parallels with The Princess and the Pauper. There's also Of Earth and Flame by Elena Galea, The Prison Healer by Lynette Noni, Midnight in Everwood by M.A. Kuznier, These Hollow Vows by Lexi Ryan, The Mermaid, the Witch in the Sea by Maggie Takuda Hall, The Faceless Woman by Emma Hamm, House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig. I made another list of the authors who were bad-mouthed, and undeservedly so. They have their debuts coming out this year, so keep an eye out for them. Because of this scandal, some of them have been packaged together on certain websites. So it's like, oh, you looked at this, maybe you'd like this. So Let Them Burn by Camilla Cole, The Poisons We Drink by Bethany Baptiste, To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods by Molly X. Chang, Voyage of the Damned by Frances White, Mistress of Lies by K.M. Enright, The Gods of Hunger series by R.M. Virtues, and these 2 authors, I think they already published, but Love Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood and The Hurricane Wars by Taya Rawnson. They also had their books bad-mouthed by this author who has disgraced themselves. I'm not naming them, not because I'm trying to avoid libel, it's just, I'm like, I don't really want to utter your name in this space. This is a nice space. This is a safe space. We have cats in this space. Anyway, I vented about that. And we are just going to move on to thanking my patrons. They're really great because I suddenly said in November that, oh, there's not going to be anything in December. I hope you're all okay with that. They were okay with that. I was very grateful. This channel is supported by ad revenue, but depending on how well the video does dictates how much revenue I get that month. So mostly I'm dependent on patrons and my theatre work to fund what I do. And I'm ever so grateful to the patrons to keep supporting my work, even though I can't predict when something's going to come up that's going to take me away from YouTube. This is why I only charge them per video I make, but not monthly. There are benefits to becoming a patron, of course. If you sign up, no matter what tier you sign up to, you'll get access to my Discord server, as well as your name in the credits like these lovely people here. But for higher level contributors, you'll get like access to a script that I write for a video, or you can get early access to a video, and highest level contributors do get a shout out in the credits. So thank you, Alison Cuff, Anna from Gustine, Annalise Barnett, Jill My Nero, Larissa, and Leslie Williams.